can join us when they want. All right. Welcome, everyone, Pierce College students, week one, microeconomics online. Week one's an important week because we sort of set the design and structure of the class and the expectations. So that's what we will start off with here in week one. So Zay, right? Is that how you say it? Zay is my only friend tonight.
Zaid.
Class. Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to share my screen so we can get right into some, what's going on with our class. All right. So first, the syllabus is right here. The most important thing on the syllabus is right there, my cell phone number. If you need anything related to our class, please don't hesitate to text me. You can text me day or night because I never had the sound on anyway. So text me whenever if you need clarification on the material or on the assignments, the academic exercises. Happy to help in any way I can to facilitate your successful completion of this class. And then this sort of outlines like what we'll be doing and such, but it's very simple as far as what it is that you're responsible to do. Every week we have the same three academic exercises. So the course load for this class has been divided equally across the 7 weeks. So every week you need to do the Connect assignments. You need to take a quiz and you need to participate in the discussion questions. So let's talk about those in more detail, all right? So the Connect assignments are the McGraw-Hill Connect assignments where these are independent learning opportunities produced by the textbook author. You got a code when you signed up, when you pay for your textbook, and that gives you access to the Connect assignments. So I'm going to change here to student view. So when you look at this from the student view, right, if you're under the assignments tab, you're under the assignments tab, and then you scroll down, it shows you here. All right, for the, hey, where did all these go? I just had these here. Hold on. Are we in the right class here? Which class is this? Is this NT3 or NT4? 4, right? Yeah, hold on.
Yep.
Yeah, give me a second here. I just clicked on the wrong course. So we are, here we are. Yeah, there we go. OT4, right?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, OT4, is that us?
Yeah, I believe so.
That's us. Okay, yeah, okay. So there we go. Microeconomics OT4. I got 280 times classes here. All right, so student view. And then you go into assignments, right? And you look down the assignments here. See that right here is like these week 1 Connect assignment, week 2 Connect assignment. Now notice that the start date and due date for all the Connect assignments, all right, the due date is the last day of class and the start date is today, but you should keep up with these each week. You shouldn't let them all go to the end. I set them up so that it's sort of a self-paced approach to completing these, but it makes way more academic sense from a learning standpoint to complete them and coincide with the material we're learning in class, right? So week 1 covers chapter 1 and chapter 2 in the Connect assignment. Week 2 covers chapter 3 and chapter 6. So these coincide with the chapters we're covering each week. So you should complete these each week. And if it's week 2 and you haven't completed any of those, you will receive a message from me saying, hey, you're falling behind on the Connect assignments. Even though the due date is April 30th, you really need to keep up with them as the independent learning opportunity within classwork. Then you have the quiz and the discussion board each week. Now I have the quiz and discussion boards up for the first 4 weeks. I'm revamping these to reflect. I always try to make especially the discussion boards, I try to make them reflect what's actually taking place in the world around us, right? So let's talk about discussion board first. Obviously, you click on this discussion board and it gives you instructions, right? So for this week, you need to read an article. Here's a link to the article. You don't need to go crazy looking for this thing. You click on this, it's a PDF file. You can download this, it's 2 pages. It's from the Wall Street Journal, and it's about this new $53 billion CHIPS program that the Biden administration is instituting to invigorate the semiconductor industry. And you're going to evaluate it from the perspective of what we're learning this week, called the economics perspective. So you're going to evaluate it from the standpoint of the definition of economics, scarcity, choices, costs, and marginal cost, marginal benefit, opportunity cost. So you're going to evaluate this article, and then you're going to construct your answer, and you're going to decide whether or not this $53 billion government involvement in the economy makes good economic sense from an economic standpoint, from the economic perspective. Now, there's detailed instructions here on how to complete the discussion questions, right? So the first one is the idea of, hey, you got to take the principles and concepts that we learned in class and incorporate them into your answers. You're more than welcome to offer your opinion. That's the point to some extent. But all of your ideas need to be grounded in sound economic thinking. So for this week, you're going to incorporate as many of these as you see possible, see fit or see necessary, these concepts from the economic perspective. Now, inevitably, not all of them apply, so don't feel the need to put all of them into the argument, but the ones that are relevant to this idea. Now, in addition to constructing your ideas around the economic concepts and principles, don't just scratch the surface, right? Detailed analysis of the question at hand. So offer some detail. Now, you don't just write for writing's sake, but just introducing an idea is not going to be enough. All right, 2 more ideas. Idea number 3 is that even if you're writing your opinion, all academic writing is in third person. Right? This is a good way to keep this from being a personal attack on each other. Right? So think of you're writing an editorial for another paper or for some, from some blog or something of that nature. So it shows you here, like, evidence from the article suggests raising taxes above a certain level reduces economic efficiency and slows economic growth. There's an example of third person, as opposed to if you say, if you were the government, you should think twice about raising taxes. As I learned, reducing, no, don't use I, don't use you, write in third person. Now, like other discussion questions from your other classes, respond to at least one of your classmates. So that means get started on this, as early as possible, right? So those are the discussion questions, and we're going to cover the economics perspective tonight in class, right? All right, the quizzes. So the week 1 quiz is going to challenge your understanding of the production possibilities model. All right, so the week 1 quiz is going to, so when you click on the week 1 quiz, first make certain that you download this production possibilities data and curve, because the questions are going to be related to the data and curve. Now, we're going to talk about in detail tonight the economics of the production possibility model. It's the building block of all economic thinking. So it's relatively important. All right. So I'm going to leave student view for a moment. All right. So this is also very important. Every week, do I do Nick and Nick? There we go. What's up, Howard? How are you? So every week, all of your academic responsibilities are outlined in the course module for the week. All right, so my computer is freezing up on me here, so give me a second. Hello, computer. Up, somebody else coming on. Come on, there we go. All right, so week 1. So when you click on week 1, this explains in detail everything that is expected of you for week 1. So a couple ideas right here. There's always going to be a link to a document for week 1, and this document is important because if you have to read any articles, obviously it'll be available like I just showed you on the discussion board. But this is one-stop shopping. They're right there. More importantly, you got lecture notes with practice questions and answers for the weekly content. So if you look on this document, right, if you download this document and say, okay, what's on here? Everything you need for week one is on this document as far from a learning perspective, especially the lecture notes with practice questions and answers. So the textbook is an excellent source, but this is excellent because if you review this, you're going to be in good shape for the quiz. Now, for many weeks, I'll give you a practice, like, so for week 2 and week 3, there are practice quizzes available. But, you know, when you talk about for week 1, right, you download this document, you're gonna be in good shape just by reviewing this because it shows you everything you need to know and to learn, like this, especially when you think about, okay, I got this quiz on the production possibilities frontier. On page 12 here, it gives you a whole bunch of good background information, notes, like, you know, about the production possibility frontier. And if you review this, you'll be in good shape for the quiz because the questions will resemble the content that's covered on that page, right? So definitely download that weekly document that has all the information you need. Now, one more thing about the weekly module. The same learning opportunity. So you got, basically you can, you know, participate in this weekly Zoom session and or watch the recording of this weekly Zoom session. You should read the chapters. So this week, chapters 1 and 2. And you should review the lecture notes with practice questions and answers, right? And then finally, I've created these YouTube videos where I explain in detail the content that we're covering each week. So these are also excellent if you want to dive deeper into a specific topic. Right, he's like, you know, we're gonna go over everything anyway with the weekly learning session. But these are good review videos as well. Right.
Yeah.
Now I already took. Go ahead.
Quick question. So those videos, because I was confused by this little area, are part 1 just for week 1?
No, part 1 and 2 are all week. Everything on here is week 1.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything in the week 1 module is applies to week 1. But again, don't feel obliged to watch all of these. Watch them sort of as necessary. And it's, you know, it's different way. Like some students, you know, some students are like, look, I never watch your videos. They don't help me. I'm like, I'm not going to be offended. Other students are like, I'd rather watch the video than read the textbook. It all depends on how, you know, your learning style. You know, some people it's a combination. Some people read the textbook and be like, oh, let me review this production possibility video because it really helps. So every week there's also PowerPoint slides that coincide with what we're learning. So I already took the liberty of, I'll download these again. So I'll just show you where they are. You click on the weekly module, and then you can go to the PowerPoint slides for each week, and those coincide with the concepts and principles that we're covering in the class, right? So in week 1, we're going to be talking about the definition and understanding of economics and what's called the economics perspective. And then we're going to talk about the production possibility frontier. So those are the 2 most important areas of content for this week, right? So let's get into sort of the heart and soul of what it is. What happened? Clicked on the wrong
Just for
thing.
clarity.
Try
I'm sorry.
open the PowerPoint. Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, brother. And just for clarity, so you're saying that watching the videos is
Yeah.
equivalent to reading chapter 1 and 2?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, pretty much. Put it this way, if you watch the videos, you'll be in excellent shape to take the quiz and
Okay.
participate in the discussion. Now, like I said, some students would rather read than watch the videos. Some students like to use a combination, right?
Okay.
All right, so what is economics? So economics is all about doing the best with the least. You say, okay, what is this class I'm taking? So we all have to face this human reality. And the reality of being on Earth is that if you look at the resources, land, capital, and labor is what we call them, that are available to produce goods and services, they are scarce relative to human wants. So if you think like, oh, we need food, shelter, clothing, all right, we need, we need in one, cell phone service and Netflix and such. We want air conditioning. So the problem with life is that the resources necessary to produce goods and services are scarce relative to the human wants and needs. So we call this the burden of scarcity. So we have unlimited human wants and limited resources. If there was an equal sign in between these two, the field of economics would not exist. Right? If resources equaled the ability to produce goods and services, then economics as a social science would not be necessary. So the question is, how do we then satisfy the most human wants, knowing that resources are scarce? So more formally, we say, okay, economics is then the social science concerned with the most efficient use of society's scarce or limited resources to maximize, to satisfy as many human wants as possible. So every society is broken into three different sectors. You got households, businesses, and I'm sorry, three components: households, businesses, and government. And we subdivide these into two sectors. So the private sector, you often hear that when you read the paper, you hear like CNBC, or you hear like the New York Times. The private sector of the economy, spending was up such and such this quarter. The private sector is people like us, households. Sometimes we call those individuals. So individuals and households are synonymous. And then businesses, right? That's the private sector. And then the public sector is government. So whenever we study these components, we have to remember that the economic concepts and principles that we are analyzing apply equally to all three of these components. So when we study something like opportunity cost and marginal thinking, when we talk about economic events creating secondary effects, well, it's important to remember that all of these principles and concepts apply to all three segments because the government should use economic rationale to make decisions just like a business does, just like human beings do, just like average everyday households. All right, so this is where we are. We're starting to build what's called the economics perspective. And the idea is, okay, we can't escape the burden of scarcity. Land, capital, and labor, right, are scarce relative to human wants. So the burden of scarcity forces us to make choices. And therefore, every time we make a choice, there's a cost involved. So as soon as we decide to utilize a resource to produce a certain good or service, it's no longer available to produce something else. So just think of simple terms. We're building a home. The lumber that we put into that home is no longer available to produce something else. We can't use that lumber for some other application. The workers who are constructing that home can't simultaneously be working at the factory down the street that manufactures, something like rivets for some other application, right? The machines that are on the job there can't be working somewhere else. So scarcity forces us to make choices. Every choice involves a cost. So that's a key idea for economists. There is every decision you make, there's always a cost involved, right? There's always a cost. There's idea of there's no such thing as a free lunch. And we talk about this idea and we call it opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is defined as the next best alternative, right? So just think about, you can't simultaneously be sitting here taking this class and, be at the Flyers game or be at the Sixers game or be, if it were, tomorrow night, you can't be at one of the March Madness games. Right? You can't simultaneously be taking this class and, working as a nurse extern at a hospital. It's just impossible to do two things. So economists measure the value of any decision by saying, what was the next best alternative? What did you give up in order to make this decision? So I can't simultaneously be sitting here teaching you people about economics and be at my friend's daughter's basketball game. So tonight, I really would love to go and see this playoff game. The opportunity cost of spending time with my students is the next best alternative, which I must forego, right? Now remember, there's always a cost. So continue to build this idea of the economics perspective, say, okay, limited resources, unlimited human wants, we should act rationally. So rational behavior, and the book, and I love the McConnell textbook. It's a good textbook. I've been using it for years. They changed it to purposeful behavior, but every other economics book I've ever read, and every newspaper, every journal, every article, they always use the term rational behavior. Economists talk about rational behavior, acting in one's own self-interest to maximize utility. So people make decisions to maximize their happiness. But remember, that applies to businesses and it applies to government. So we're going to be talking because when we look at the structure of this class, this is microeconomics. We're going to say, okay, how many workers should a firm hire? And we'll say, okay, they should act to maximize profits. So that would be rational behavior. So should the firm expand into a new market? Well, if they believe it's profitable, that's rational behavior. Then we'll talk about government, and we'll talk about how much government regulation is necessary to maintain competition within an industry. So this idea of rational behavior applies to households, it applies to business, and it applies to government, all three sectors of the economy. Now, again, I used this term when I was defining. Utility is simply a measure of happiness, satisfaction, or gratification. Now, this next idea, economic thinking, is marginal thinking. So if you're taking notes or you're sort of jotting down ideas, this one's important. Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. So economists think at the margin quite often. They use marginal analysis and say, what does that mean? All right, here's what it means. All right, you're taking undergraduate classes. Would you consider continuing your education and getting a master's degree? Right? So you have a certain level of education. You had, a high school equivalency or a high school diploma, and now you're getting a college degree. When you finish undergraduate, would you get a master's degree? And you think, okay, at the margin, how much will that additional education benefit me? And what will be the cost of getting a master's degree, right? Thinking like something like, okay, I work out every week for 6 hours. Should I work out for 8 hours or should I cut it back to 4 hours? And for an economist, a decision makes sense as long as the additional unit brings more benefit than it yields costs, right? So we call these marginal benefits and marginal costs. So for a person, if you're studying 10 hours per week for your classes, should you ramp it up to 12 hours per week? Okay, well, the additional study of 2 more hours, working on assignments and studying for quizzes and finishing papers, that will improve your academic standing. At the same time, you'll have less time for, for occupational responsibilities, for time with family, right? So you weigh what, the benefits and the costs. Is the benefit of additional study / schoolwork greater than the cost of what you have to give up, to spend those extra 2 hours working on academic exercise? So we're going to talk specifically for a business. We'll say, okay, we weigh the marginal cost of producing the next unit of output versus the revenue the firm will receive from producing and selling that, right? For the government, we'll say, okay, marginal cost is, all right, well, we can add more police force, but that means there's less tax funds available for education, right? We can add more road improvement, but at the same time, that means there's less money available for improving the parks and recs, in the city or something. So all decisions involve marginal thinking. Right, this one's important too. Incentives matter. If you change the rules of engagement, people's behavior will change. So for instance, if I said, anybody that gets 100 on the quiz this week, well, then you would study like gangbusters to get 100 because you're like, if I said anybody gets 100 on the quiz this week, doesn't have to take quizzes for the rest of the term. Like, damn, that's a good deal. I'll do that. Like, so if you change the rules of engagement, people's behavior will change. If the federal government said, if you pay your taxes early, you get a 20% discount. Well, everybody would pay their taxes early because they want to get that 20% discount, right? So changing the rules of engagement changes human behavior. And this sort of leads to the last idea on this slide. Economic events create secondary effects, right? So economic events don't happen in a vacuum. So if we said, okay, anybody who pays their taxes prior to February 14th, right, Valentine's Day, and we'll call it, 2 months early for your taxes, you get a discount. Well, the incentive will make people pay taxes earlier. The secondary effect is that the government would collect less in tax revenues, and then therefore they'd have less money to spend on social welfare programs, right? Now, we're seeing this happening before us. What happened last week with this banking system, right? This Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. And then you see all the secondary effects of what happened to markets this week, and how it's affecting treasury securities and such. Now, that's a bit more of, a macro picture. We're studying macro and we're studying micro, right? We'll talk about the difference between micro and macro shortly, but it's a good example of when an economic event happens, it causes a cascade effect, right? Okay, so we have a lot to do in a limited amount of time, but I'll let you guys pick, either Howard or Zai, which one of these. The field of economics applies basically to everything, because when you think about scarcity, choices, and cost, limited resources, unlimited human wants, right? That applies to every field. So why study economics is because these principles and concepts are applicable to every aspect of life. So which one of these do you want to choose as a topic to demonstrate how economics applies to everything? Which one looks interesting to discuss for a few minutes?
Education looks good to me.
All right, education, right? So we already spend a ton of money on education at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. But we're not exactly achieving a great outcome in education, especially in urban settings, right? But we know there's a correlation between achieving a certain level of education and occupational success, right? So it makes sense that we should take some of our scarce resources, in this case, the revenue collected by the government that's allocated across multiple social services, including healthcare, including military, including road improvement, right, including environmental issues and such. And we should address education. We say, okay, if we get people educated to a higher level, there's probably a very good chance that they'll need less financial and economic assistance as they age, because they'll be in a position for occupational opportunities. We also know that there's a direct correlation between the amount of education a person achieves and their probability of incarceration. So if you look and say, geez, then when you look at the number of people incarcerated in the United States, most of them, not all of them, most of them don't have a college degree, right? Most of them, a lot of them didn't finish high school. So sometimes there's a correlation between criminality, crime, and lack of economic opportunity. So the question is, how do we efficiently improve the educational system? Because it seems like, throwing money at the problem hasn't been a solution. Maybe we're not doing it wisely enough. Maybe we need to allocate more funds to it, but we have to be wiser about how we allocate them. Because you can see all the economic benefits of education. Now, when we talk about later in the evening about the production possibilities frontier, then we'll talk on a macro scale and say, geez, a better educated workforce is an improved labor resource, and then any improvement in a resource will shift the production possibilities curve to the right and generate economic growth. So not only from the standpoint of the individuals, you can improve their lives, but from a macro standpoint, you're going to make society better by improving educational opportunities for people, right? Now, it's already 7:06. If we had like, a 3-hour class, we could go over easily, like, 3 more of these, right? But if we have time, maybe we'll come back. But it demonstrates that, why studying economics is important. And for you personally, this class should broaden your scope about, understanding the personal decision-making process and sort of the role of government in regulating societies, from an economic standpoint. All right, now, every 4 years we elect a president. Every couple of years, we elect senators and congressmen and women. Right? We have state and local elections, and we'll talk about the different types of government. Every idea proposed by politicians today was offered to society by economists yesterday. So when you look at these people, right? Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, John Maynard Keynes, and Karl Marx, right? So these are familiar names. Capitalism owes its theory to this guy, Adam Smith. 1776, Wealth of Nations, sort of the Bible of free markets and the benefits and efficiency of allowing markets to determine what goods should produce and how they should produce and how many they should produce and such. And then comes along this guy, Karl Marx, right? 1860s, he writes Das Kapital, and it's a refute of capitalism and talks about the ills of this as an economic system. And even till today, right, we have capitalism when we have a socialism / communism as the 2 great economic systems, and all decisions are driven by the theories that these gentlemen proposed, right? And inevitably, we tend to operate in between these 2 types of governments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, right? David Ricardo, somebody we'll visit later in the term when we study international trade. He is the economist who offered the ideas what's called a comparative advantage, the reason why it makes sense to specialize in producing a certain product and trade for other products. Now, this guy, we won't get to talk about too much in this class. If you took the macro class, you would take it. But John Maynard Keynes is the economist who wrote during the Depression, and he was actually quite famous. He wrote, before, during, and after World War I, and then during the Great Depression. And his economic ideas gave rise to the idea of far more government involvement in the economy. So all the ideas proposed by politicians today are grounded in the theories of economists from yesteryear. All right, now we'll go through some of this a little bit quicker. But so part of the economics perspective is, number one, economists use terms differently than your average everyday person. So when we look at more formally, the 4 types of economic resources, and you say, okay, a land resource receives rent. So an example of a land resource would be something like copper, natural gas, timber, oil. So if you drill for oil and you sell a barrel of oil, the money that the owner of the oil field receives is called rent or rental income. That's a little bit abnormal from the way we typically understand the term rent. So we have to be aware of how economists use terms differently than the average person. When we're building economic theory, we use this idea called generalizations, aka tendency of the norm. So we just said economics is a social science. You're studying people in the everyday business of life. Not everyone will act the same, but let's assume that the government is trying to enact some tax policy to influence the economy. So during a recession, you say, okay, during a recession, governments typically lower taxes, and that stimulates spending. And that's, a general idea of what we call fiscal policy when the economy goes into a downturn. So 9 out of 10 people will spend, if not a good portion, all of their tax break. Whether they get one lump sum or they get a little bit more in their paycheck every week for 26 or 52 weeks. Generally speaking, 9 out of 10 people will spend that additional money. So when building a model of the economy, we have to go with what's called the tendency of the norm. We can't worry about the 5 or 10% of people that, like Sally Saver and Frugal Frank, that will save all the money. So when we build economic models, we build them around what the most likely outcome of most people, right? The vast majority of people, right? Now, this Latin phrase, ceteris paribus, other things equal. When examining a specific variable, we have to assume that nothing else is changing when we're building a model. So for instance, how will lower interest rates affect business investments? That's assuming that, the economy hasn't gone over the cliff into a tank and, into a deep recession. It also assumes that, tax policy hasn't changed. It also assumes that the structure of the industry hasn't changed. Now we know that simultaneously things can be changing at the same time, but to make sense of any variable, we employ this other things equal. Which, okay, if nothing else changed, how would altering this one variable influence economic decisions and such, right? Now we're going to build a bunch of models and graphs, and we're going to include as many aspects as necessary, knowing that we can't include everything. All right, so like I said, economics is broadly divided into macro and micro. So the field of economics is divided into macro and micro. Macro is the aggregate from the big picture, right? So business cycle, unemployment, inflation, fiscal and monetary policy, right? Those are your macroeconomic topics that looking at the economy in total. Micro looks at the individual decision makers within the larger frame of the economy. So popular topics in micro might be an investigation into something like the technology industry or government regulation of the airline industry, or how a firm makes decisions in both the short run and long run to maximize profit, depending on the type of industry in which they're competing, right? So those are microeconomic topics. Now, these two divisions are not mutually exclusive. So for instance, you say, okay, what about the oil industry? Is that a micro topic or a macro topic? Well, you could argue it's micro from the standpoint it's just one industry, but you could argue it's macro because the price of oil influences everything, like the price of gasoline and heating, giant operating firms and such. So they're not totally mutually exclusive. All right, positive versus normative economics. So there's no arguing about what we call positive economics. These are statements about the way life is, objective, truth statements. So if I said right now, the unemployment rate in the United States is 3.5%, that's a true statement. You can't argue with that. Now you could say then a normative statement, so you could say, President Biden's economic policies are the reason why the unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. That's an opinion. So economists differentiate between facts and opinions. Facts are called positive economic statements. Opinions are called normative economic statements. Now, undoubtedly, there's going to be a lot of gray area. Right? You might think that the Republicans are doing a great job. I might think the Democrats are doing a great job. You might think that neither party is doing a great job, right? So there's going to be a lot of ambiguity, argument, gray area, regardless of which positive economics we agree on, right? So that's what makes economics very interesting. All right, audience participation time. So, Howard, economic growth. what statistic does the government use to measure total economic activity for the nation for 1 year? What do they report?
That's something I don't know right now.
Sorry. I'll give you a hint. It's 3 letters. GDP, gross domestic product.
Okay.
So we have a $20 trillion economy. So it makes sense if we have this burden of scarcity that we try to continue to grow the economy. So if the economy is 20 trillion and the $21 trillion economy, the average rate of economic growth since World War II has been about just under 3%. So economic growth reduces or lessens the burden of scarcity. It improves people's standard of living. So that seems like a reasonable goal, right? Now, here's the problem with these goals. No one's going to argue economic growth isn't a good idea. But there's going to be a trade-off because when we look at these 8 economic goals, some of them are compatible and some of them conflict. So achieving the highest level of economic growth might conflict with this one, equitable distribution of income. Equitable distribution of income means we try to alter the flow of income to sustain economic viability for everyone. Now, the only mechanism that the government has to achieve this is taxes. But here's the problem: if we tax income earners at a higher rate, we're going to slow the economy. I just simply, it's a fact, right? If you don't believe me, if you look at, prior to the 2008 recession, for the 30 years before that, right, European countries had higher taxes than the United States, and their economic growth rates were on average about half the United States. So they said, okay, we're gonna have a greater social welfare state at the cost of slower economic growth. So the problem with our goals is that some of them are complementary and some of them conflict. Full employment means providing a job for everybody that willing, able to work. Right, that makes sense. Economic efficiency means putting to use all our resources to achieve the most effective means of producing goods and services. Number 4 is a problem we had with the last 18, 20 months, price level stability. We don't want to have super crazy high inflation because then people's paychecks aren't rising at the same rate as the goods and services they have to purchase. So we have these 8 economic goals. Some of them are complementary, some of them conflict. So for instance, economic freedom means the government should get out of the way and let business be business. That's excellent, right? We'll achieve great growth, but the problem is, at what expense? We're going to have pollution, unsafe work conditions. So absolute economic freedom leads to all sorts of problems. Right now, generally, most people don't argue with this one. Economic security simply means providing for people who are unable to provide for themselves. So for whatever reason, you're unable to achieve occupational success because of some physical difference. Now, the last one, something we're going to visit at the end of our class. Last year, the United States had a record trade deficit. We know that the United States imports lots of goods and services from other countries and exports lots of goods and services to other countries. The United States had a trade deficit of, I think it was $876 billion was the total trade deficit. Right? We have to finance that trade deficit by borrowing or selling off assets. And the big issue with the trade deficit is one word, China, is that about half of our trade deficit is with one country. So we're going to keep these economic goals in mind as we go through our study. All right. All right, now we're doing 720. Okay. Okay. So there's 2 economic systems. Oops. There we go. Capitalism and socialism. Under capitalism, you have private ownership of economic resources. Under socialism or the command system, you have government control of the economic resources. So the big difference between these 2 economic systems is who owns the means of production. in the market command system, in the market capitalist system, private ownership of economic resources. In socialism command system, public ownership of economic resources. Either way, the system has to answer these questions. What to produce, how to produce, how much of it to produce, and who gets the benefits. Those are the four basic economic questions. And then over time, the system has to answer the question of how to accommodate change. So the structure of capitalism is such that it generally leads to a more efficient outcome because we allow markets to determine prices of goods and services. We allow this invisible hand, the rationing function of prices, to determine how resources are allocated. The government tries not to get in the way too much, and it leads to innovation and efficiency, and it provides incentives. Socialism sounds good in theory because you say, okay, the government controls the means of production, and we have this central planning institute, and they decide what goods and services will be produced. They also decide the prices of each good and services. Unfortunately, the market mechanism is far more efficient at determining how resources should be allocated and what price of goods and services should be. It's crazy because you think, okay, this sounds good in theory from this standpoint. You're trying to achieve an equitable society. So in an effort to make everyone equal, we actually make people worse off because it's difficult to have efficiency, innovation, and it skews incentives within socialism. But neither system is perfect. This slide is very telling. When you say, okay, in the real world, economies operate somewhere between pure capitalism and pure socialism. Right? Even North Korea has some aspects of market systems. The United States and Japan are not pure free market capitalism. There's definitely some social welfare aspects to our economy. Right? European countries are more left-leaning than the United States, but nowhere near, absolute communism. China emerged from its economic hibernation in 1978 and has done an interesting job of trying to have this balance of capitalism and command of the greater economy, and it has worked out for them rather well in many aspects. But there's still not the huge problem with human rights violations over there. All right. So quick review. We talked about definition of economics, rational behavior, opportunity cost, marginal analysis, incentives, economic events creating secondary effects, generalizations, the ceteris paribus assumption. We talked about micro versus macro, positive versus normative. We visited the 8 economic goals. Now, we didn't talk about these, the economic fallacies. So let's visit those very quickly. The economic fallacies. There's 3 pitfalls to economic thinking. The first one's called the fallacy of composition. What's good for the individual is good for the group as a whole. This will be important for us when we start looking at our market studies and such. We talk about pure competition, monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition. All right. So one farmer has a great growing season and has an unbelievable yield for their crop and believes that year he's going to have this tremendous profit at the end of the harvest. But it turns out that every farmer had the same tremendous growing season. Supply goes through the roof, whose output is so outstanding, and prices plummet. So what's good for the individual is not necessarily good for the group as a whole. It is a fallacy to just believe that flat out without investigating. Post hoc fallacy, this one's easy. Event A precedes event B, therefore event A caused event B. Let me give you an example of this. When Donald Trump took office, 3 months after he was in office, the economic data came out and suggested that the economy was growing faster. And then he tried to claim that it was his policies that caused economic growth to speed up. Where, you're talking about a glacier. The US economy is this enormous $20 trillion unit of production. It's difficult to argue that just because he was elected and 3 months later, the economy was growing slightly faster, that his policies, which really hadn't taken hold yet, had anything to do with the economy growing faster, right? So just because A precedes B doesn't mean A caused B. Now, correlation versus causation. This one's interesting from the standpoint of economics. Says, we can't just assume that because information suggests outcome, that information actually causes outcome. So the government, this was George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, and George Bush Jr., all made this drastic mistake. And it had to do with the housing market. They looked at the statistics for people that own houses. They said, oh, people that own houses, they achieve a high level of educational success. They achieve a high degree of economic and financial independence and success. They get married and stay married longer. They stay in jobs longer. They accrue money in their 401ks. And they looked and said, there must be some correlation between home ownership and economic and financial stability. Well, using that wrong assumption, they try to catapult more people into home ownership with tragic results. There's a lot of people in the low to middle income arena that shouldn't own homes because when you own a house, you have expenses you don't have when you rent. So for instance, you had to pay for not only your mortgage, but your taxes and your insurance and your home repairs, right? So this led to, in big part, to the housing collapse because the government forced all kinds of new lending practices on the banking sector. And the government's correlation versus causation mistake was a huge misstep when it came to determining which people should own houses and which people shouldn't. We actually did people an economic and financial disservice with this sort of misinformation from, a good example of that fallacy. Now, the one we didn't
Professor.
talk about, Gad,
So what's the big difference between correlation versus causation and what was it?
the post hoc one.
Yeah.
So this one simply says, all right. So for instance, a lot of times politicians, economists, any scientists, they'll claim that because event A preceded event B, event A caused event B, right? So for instance, right, you could say that, okay, let's think of a President Biden policy. And let's say, if we're trying to defend President Biden, we say, okay, President Biden his administration, with the help of Congress, the House and the Senate, that they just passed the Inflation Reduction Act. That was about 6 months ago, right? Now, inflation has come down slightly over the last 6 months. So if anyone in the Biden administration claims, hey, look, the Inflation Reduction Act is working, right? We passed this bill 6 months ago and now inflation's come down. That's not necessarily true. It could be highly coincidental that, the bill was passed and then inflation came down. In other words, inflation was going to come down anyway, and it could be far more related to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates astronomically over the last 12 to 14 months than the Biden administration Inflation Reduction Act, right? That's post hoc ergo propter, A before B. Correlation versus causation is just trying to say that, this information makes sense and causes that outcome. All right. The one thing we didn't talk about here, and we'll talk about later in the term, but we should at least mention is this idea of economists are big proponents of voluntary trade, right? So it makes sense from an economic standpoint for people to specialize in producing a good or providing a service in which they have what's called a comparative advantage. And we're going to get into that in way more detail, but for simple starters and introduction to this idea, economists believe that efficiency can be gained by both individuals and countries concentrating their economic efforts in which they have some sort of advantage and trading for other goods and services. And at the end of the term, we'll go into this in way more detail. All right, so now we're going to move on to the production possibilities frontier. So this is what we're visiting here. That we're aiming at this production possibility frontier, this production possibility curve. So for a given period of time, what we're going to discuss is how can we represent the economy's limits of production. So this might represent 1 month's worth of production. So this production possibility curve, this production possibility frontier says, okay, understanding that we have limited resources, land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur, and unlimited wants, there's going to be an absolute limitation to our country's production. Right? We would never be able to produce beyond this black curve. Right? So this curve is going to represent the absolute maximum level of output for a nation for a specific amount of time. So this might be like 1 month, it could be for the year, right? So we're going to denote a specific amount of time, and then there's going to be trade-offs. So you have one type of good graphed on the horizontal, and another type of output or good graphed on the vertical. We're going to call these consumer goods, pizzas. And we're going to call these capital goods, robots. So pizzas, consumer goods, they satisfy economic wants directly and immediately. Right? So any consumer good would be like, okay, I get new carpets for my living room. Right? I get new LED lights for my bathroom. Right? I get my teeth cleaned at the dentist. Right? I go get my car tuned up. All of those are consumer goods, right? Goods and services. Capital goods are machines, equipment, tools, and factories. These are the manufactured aids that are used in the productive process, right? So whether it's a giant earth mover used to extract lithium from the ground, or it's a software system used by Amazon to track packages, or it's a pickup truck used by a landscaper to deliver fertilizer to a job site, right? So these robots, these capital goods, these satisfy economic wants indirectly and over time, and they're used as, you know, they're manufactured aid or tools used in the productive process. So all machines, equipments, tools, factories, right? So here's the idea. This curve represents the absolute maximum level of production that can take place for the time being. Now, why is there a limit? Because for the time being, we have fixed resources in quantity and quality, right? So the land, the capital, the labor, the entrepreneurs that are available to be used or implemented in the productive process, they're fixed in quantity and quality. And we have a fixed technology. Like down the road, we'll get better at, you know, better machines and more new and improved systems, and, you know, we'll have, you know, more educated people and such. But for the time being, because we have fixed resources in quantity and quality and fixed technology, right? Our limited resources, land, capital, labor, there's an absolute maximum level of production that can take place. So the first idea is limitation of production. The second is what we call choices, trade-offs, and costs. So we could put all of our resources in one basket, say, we're just going to make capital goods, we're just going to make robots at point A. The cost is then we get no consumer goods. We could take all the land, capital, labor, and just make consumer goods, but then we have no machines, equipment, and tools, no robots. So here's the problem. Every time we want more of one type of output, the only way to achieve additional units of that type of output is by giving up some of the other type of production. So if we want more pizzas, more consumer goods, that's only possible by giving up capital goods. And same thing to this standpoint, if we started to say, okay, we're making consumer goods and we want more capital goods, that's only possible by giving up consumer goods. Right? Then we're going to talk about two more ideas: economic efficiency and economic growth. So if we put to use all of our available resources and we produce in the most cost-effective method, we can achieve output, we can achieve production somewhere along this curve. Now, we're going to get real formal about that in a moment. We're going to call it full employment and productive efficiency. So if we're using all of society's available resources, we call that full employment, and we're producing using the least cost method of production, that's called productive efficiency, we can achieve output somewhere along the curve. So anywhere in here means we're not using all of our available resources. We're not achieving full employment. So any point inside the curve is what we call attainable but inefficient. We're not using all of society's resources. We could be doing better. We could be producing more robots, more pizzas, or more of both of them, right? Any point outside the curve, for now, that looks tremendous, but we can't get there. So any point out here says desirable but unattainable. Unattainable because we only have so much land, capital, and labor available. Right? We have a fixed amount of technology. We'll never be able to achieve here for the time being. Right? In the future, we might be able to shift this curve to the right by getting an improvement in the quantity or quality of resources and an improvement in technology to achieve what we call economic growth. So let's take a moment and then review now what we just discussed. So here's the important ideas. The 4 lessons of the production possibilities model. All right, I just went over these, but let's formalize them. Limitations of production. The production possibility frontier, also called the production possibility curve, demonstrates absolute limitations of production for a specific or given amount of time, right? The next economic lesson is that it demonstrates choices, trade-offs, and costs. We can't have more of good X without giving up some of good Y. We can't have more consumer goods without giving up capital goods. Right? The third economic lesson, efficiency. And we're going to talk about 3 types of efficiency. I already mentioned 2 of them. Full employment and productive efficiency. We're going to talk about a third one called allocated efficiency. And then economic growth. So let's talk about efficiency in more detail. Full employment is the easiest one to define. It simply means putting to use all of your available resources. So all land, capital, labor, and entrepreneurs available at the time being, they're all being put to use. Productive efficiency is a little more specific in its connotational meaning. Think of any good or any service, and then in your head, think about, okay, how much would it cost to produce that in terms of resources? So you can do something simple and be like, okay, Amazon delivers all of these products to us in cardboard boxes. Okay, well, how much does a cardboard box cost to produce? Right, well, you got some land, you got some capital, you got some labor, you got the entrepreneur who designed the box. Let's say, a 6-inch by 8-inch box. Let's say, a decent type of cardboard that you can make one of those for 50 cents, right? Or $1. Let's just round it up to $1. You can make one of those for $1. The economist says, well, don't use $2 worth of resources if you can manufacture that product with $1 worth of resources. So use the least cost method of production whenever you're producing any good or service. I think it's something you have in your house, like, a ceiling fan. Okay, well, that took a certain amount of land resources. There's some metal in there, probably some wood, some plastic, some labor putting it together, right? Some capital, some machine used to press those, pieces together and manufacture. And the entrepreneur designed it. Let's say, you can make one of those for, $48. Well, the economist says, okay, use the least cost method of production, the least number of resources necessary. Don't use $54 worth of resources, right? Now, it doesn't mean make cheap junk. It just says you use the most cost-effective method from putting to work the least amount of resources necessary to produce it. Now, the last one, allocative efficiency. All right, so let's look at this again. All right, you guys have to tell me. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to decide. So let's assume that we have to choose between these 5 potential points on the curve as our level of output. So we probably don't want to choose point A. That's all capital goods, all robots, right? We probably don't want to choose point E. That's all pizzas, no capital goods, no machines and equipment and tools and factories, all consumer goods. So we have B, C, and D as choices of what we call allocative efficiency. So what this means is the mix of output, the combination of capital goods and services, right? The mix of production that maximizes society's utility, aka happiness. So allocative efficiency is the mix of output that makes society most happy. What combination of pizzas and robots? What combination of consumer goods and capital goods makes people the happiest? So which point do you think it is on this curve, B, C, or D?
I'd say D.
Right, so if you look at this, you say, I would say D as well. If I had no other choice, I would say D. Now, the book gives you these numbers. You would have to be given these numbers. You couldn't determine this without the book's help. So the book makes this up and say, okay, what if we knew the marginal benefits and marginal cost of pizza production, right? So on the horizontal axis in quantity, this is the number of pizzas produced and consumed. On this vertical axis, in dollar terms, we're measuring marginal benefits, marginal cost. So the point of this exercise is twofold. Number one, we determine allocative efficiency. We determine the mix of output that maximizes society's happiness by evaluating marginal benefits and marginal cost, right? Number two, this is a normative decision. It's subjective. It's based on people's opinions. So two societies with the same type of political economic systems and same access to resources might choose differently, right? And we saw this in the 1980s with the Japanese versus the Americans. The Japanese were more interested in capital goods and manufacturing output for machines and equipment and such. And the Americans were much more interested in consumer-driven economy, right? So let's go through this exercise and say, okay, this is the marginal benefit of consuming each pizza. So you notice right away that the benefit of consuming the next pizza falls. Right? We call this diminishing marginal utility. And this is a common human experience idea. As you consume more of a good or service, it provides or yields less and less happiness. So the first unit of pizza, you're like, man, that yields society $15 worth of happiness. The second unit of pizza, happiness falls all the way down to $10. And the marginal benefit of the third unit of pizza falls all the way to $5. Oops. So that's typical of most human experiences where as you consume more of a good or service, it provides less and less happiness, right? Now, marginal costs start low and then they rise. Here's the reason. In the beginning, when we produce this first unit of pizzas, now remember, this could be in thousands or millions, and in the book it says it's in thousands. The numbers are less important than the idea. When you start producing pizza, there's lots and lots of resources available. So there's lots and lots of land, capital, and labor available. So the marginal cost of producing the first one is low, only 5. The marginal cost of producing the second one is higher, 10. And the marginal cost of producing the third one is way higher, 15. So X marks the spot. We're saying at 2 units of pizzas, what we know is this, that the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. The society says, all right, we want to stop at producing 2 units of pizzas because allocating any more resources towards pizza production, costs exceed benefit. Any fewer, benefits exceed costs, right? So we know is that this society is happiest when they allocate enough land, capital, and labor to produce 2 pizzas. And then we go back to this table back here. Oops, sorry. We go back to this table and we say, geez, that doesn't equal point D on the curve like we thought it would. That actually works out to be point C. So for this society, the allocatively efficient point on the production possibilities curve is point C, right? So we go back to the, because that's where 2 units of pizza is. Now, you might say, well, we only did the exercise for pizzas. How do we know that we'll end up with 7 robots? Well, because the whole idea we just went over is, okay, if we're achieving full employment and we allocate enough land, capital, and labor to produce 2 pizzas here, all the other resources will be used to produce robots, and that works out to be 7, right? All right, now, this is something you'll go over when you do your Connect assignments, but I wanted to do it quickly. The idea is, here are the resources more formally. The economists break them into property and human resources. Land is any of the gifts of nature. I mentioned them earlier, like, timber, minerals, water, copper, natural gas, right? And land receives rent or rental income. So each of these resources has a specific type of income associated with it. Capital, the manufactured aids or tools, right? They receive interest income. And I gave you several examples of capital resources earlier, right? Now, even, if you're an accountant and use a pencil to calculate something, that pencil is a piece of capital. Or if you're like, okay, we're IBM and we have a giant mainframe computer that stores all the cloud information, that's capital, right? Labor, the human skills that are used, for mental and physical activities in the productive process. And labor receives wages. Now, the unique one here is the entrepreneur. You can hear this is a French term, entrepreneur. Jean-Baptiste Say was an economist who said, all right, who adds it all up? So the entrepreneur is a unique person because they got these type of attributes. One is that they decide how the resources should be combined and allocated, right? So they take this initiative as saying, we need this much land, capital, and labor. Then they make big decisions like, okay, what products should be innovated? What products could be produced? What new product could be introduced? What new technique to produce products, right? They make policy decisions. So even within the framework of a larger company, you might have an entrepreneur. Now, the interesting thing from the standpoint of outcome is that the entrepreneur bears risk. So land receives rent or rental income. Capital, when used, receives interest income. Labor receives wages. The entrepreneur could achieve profit if successful, but also could bear losses if unsuccessful, right? All right, now let's talk about a few more things for the production possibility frontier. First, the shape of the curve is going to matter. So when we look at this curve here, this is one person performing 2 highly similar tasks. So this is an example of what we call the Sarah study world. Sarah is only taking 2 classes this term, accounting and economics. Her entire grade is determined by her final exam. And she has left all the work till the night before. So she has 10 hours to study. If she studies just for accounting, she'll get an A in accounting. Oops, sorry. If she studies just for econ, she'll get an A in econ. So this is her production possibility frontier. Now notice, this is a straight or linear production possibility frontier. We're going to revisit this when we study international trade, when we talk about comparative advantage. So this is the Sarah study world. Now, obviously, she could say, all right, I don't want to do all 10 hours for accounting. How about 7.5 hours for accounting and 2.5 hours for econ? Well, the choice is trade-offs and cost. She can't have an A in both classes. A little bit of time towards econ, her econ grade goes up, her accounting grade goes down, right? A little bit more time for econ, again, better economics grade, a little worse accounting grade. And we can do the same exercise here. Now, why is it that this is a straight production possibility frontier? A linear production possibility frontier suggests the economic resources necessary to produce both types of outputs are highly similar and applicable to both outcomes. So for instance, if we could say, okay, this could be wheat and corn. So they're both agricultural outputs. In that case, we have a linear production possibility frontier where the economic resources necessary to produce these two types of production are equally applicable to both types of outputs, right? In that case, what we have is called constant costs along the curve. Every time you want more of one type of output, you give up the same amount of the other. So that's the important idea here. When a production possibility frontier, when a production possibility curve is straight or linear, you have constant costs along the curve, which means the opportunity cost of one good in terms of the other good always remains the same. That's different when we look at our production possibility frontier for our macroeconomic sense in terms of pizzas and robots, consumer goods and capital goods, right? Anytime a production possibility frontier has curvature, has concavity, it demonstrates what's called the law of increasing, oops, too fast. The law of increasing opportunity costs. Now we can see this mathematically, and this is going to be important for your quiz. I'll show you a real trick here. How do you calculate opportunity cost? All right, well, what if we're at point A as an apple and say, all right, we're not producing any pizzas, all robots. What's the opportunity cost of our first unit of pizza? Well, when we move from A to B, we make a marginal choice. We get one consumer good, one pizza. Robot production goes down by one. So the opportunity cost of the first pizza is one robot. But look what happens when we want another pizza. When we move from B to C, pizza production goes up by one more, but robot production falls by two, from 9 to 7. And then when we went from C as in cookie to D as in dog, right? Pizza production goes up another one, but robot production falls by 3. And then the last pizza cost 4. So we noticed that the math coincides with the economics. We said if the production possibility frontier is curved, if it has concavity, it demonstrates this law of increasing opportunity cost. Each successive marginal choice costs more than the previous choice. Every time we want another pizza, it costs us more in terms of robots than the previous choice. First, the economic reasoning. In the short run, the resources necessary to produce two vastly different types of output, capital goods versus consumer goods, robots versus pizza, they're not readily adaptable, changeable, or shiftable. So therefore, it's going to cost more each successful choice, right? Now, it doesn't matter if we move from consumer goods to capital goods or capital goods to consumer goods. The fact that the resources in the short run are not readily adaptable or changeable in between these two types of vastly different types of production, that's why the law of increasing opportunity cost exists. But let me show you a little trick that's going to help you always calculate opportunity cost correctly. What if we started at E as in everyone, or elephant, and moved back towards A as an apple? And we said, okay, what if we calculate the opportunity cost of robots in terms of the pizzas we give up? So if we start at E as in everyone, no robots, all pizzas. What's the cost of the first robot? Well, when we move from E to D, we get 4 robots. We gave up we gave up 1 pizza. But each of these robots cost 1/4 of a pizza. Let me show you how you can calculate this all the time correctly. Here's what you do. Whatever you're getting, put that on your denominator, the bottom of your fraction. Whatever you're giving up, put it on your numerator. So in this case, we went from E to D. We got in total 4 pizzas. In total, we gave up we got 4 robots. We gave up 1 pizza. Each robot cost 1/4 of a pizza. Whatever you're getting, we got 4 robots, put that on your denominator. Whatever you're giving up, put that on your numerator. Now, let's demonstrate that the law of increasing opportunity cost exists moving in this direction as well. Yes, the resources are not readily adaptable or shiftable between these 2 vastly different types of production. When we move from D to C, right? 3 robots, 1 pizza, getting 3, giving up 1, 1/3. Each robot costs 1/3 of a pizza. From C to D, each robot costs 1/2 of the pizza. And from B to A, each robot costs 1 pizza. So it doesn't matter which direction we move, right? Always remember that trick though. Whatever you're getting, put it on the bottom, your denominator of your fraction when calculating opportunity cost. Whatever you're giving up, put it on your numerator. Now, one more important observation here. Does it matter for the future, B versus D? Does your normative choice today matter for economic growth moving forward? Well, first, let's look at economic growth. All right, so let's assume here we are today, the curve we just studied, A, B, C, D, E. All right, that's the best we can do with our limited or scarce resources, fixed technology. All right, our resources are fixed in quantity and quality. Our technology is fixed. But inevitably, down the road, we're going to have access to better resources or an improvement in the number of resources or an improvement in technology. So improvements in technology / productivity generate 2/3 of all economic growth. So in the real world, technology improvements are far more important towards the economic growth of the nation. So improvements in technology generate 2/3 of all economic growth. An increase in the quantity or quality of resources is responsible for about 1/3 of economic growth, right? So there was a really good article in The Economist about a crazy efficient way to capture and transport energy. About 5% of the energy is lost along lines right now. And capturing solar and wind energy has been extremely difficult. You know, it's good if you can generate it and use it right away, but storing it for the future is a challenge. So these crazy, smart, intelligent women and men that are way smarter than me, they came up with this system of these superconductors, and it's all detailed in the Wall Street Journal, how they're able to reduce the temperature necessary to do. Sorry, actually, it had to be super cold to store it. They can actually do this at a more reasonable temperature, right? So all this scientific advancement, that's going to generate crazy economic growth over the next 5 or 10 years, right? It's just a much more efficient use of energy. That's going to generate economic growth. So here's my question earlier though. Does it matter? Say, okay, choice B as in boy versus D as in dog, which one will generate better economic growth moving forward? And here's what we've learned as economists. An economy that will choose more capital good production today at the expense of fewer consumer goods tends to generate better economic growth. So B as in boy, as opposed to D as in dog, would tend to generate better economic growth moving forward. And the economic rationale reason for that is because an economy that chooses B as in boy is saying we're willing to forego some present consumption to allocate more of our economic output towards capital goods, towards future consumption. So theoretically, when we look at this, there's a nice slide here that shows you this. 2 economies that start off with the same production possibility frontier, A and B. A says we want to choose a point closer to consumer goods for the present, because consumer goods satisfy economic ones directly and immediately. Economy B says, we're gonna choose more capital good production today, goods for the future. Theoretically, that'll tend to generate better economic growth moving forward. Right? All right, it's just about 8 o'clock. And it's about an hour and a half worth of learning. So do you guys have any questions before I let you go for the week? That pretty much covers everything you need to know. So remember, Connect assignments available through the assignments tab. The discussion board, please reread the directions, and the article you need to read is right there. And then the quiz, and the quiz challenges you to demonstrate an understanding of everything we just learned about the production possibility frontier. Remembering that on that week 1 document, there's a good review of all that material as well. All right, boys. Hopefully we'll have a couple more participants next week. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. Happy to help.
I appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
You got it, guys. Take care. Bye.
All right.
Bye.